This episode is brought to you by, you guessed it, Manscaped. Call them what you want, knee knockers, golden nuggets, thigh slappers, but our friends at Manscaped.com refer to them as the boys. Not every man has children, but every man is responsible for their 2 boys below the waist. The boys need love too, so join the 10 million men worldwide who trust Manscaped by going to Manscaped.com and use offer code DARKAGES for 20% off and free shipping. Every man knows how scary it can be when going for a close shave below the waist, and that's why I, for one, trust Manscaped for the sensitive areas. The Lawnmower family of shaving products includes the Lawnmower 3.0 Plus, the 4.0 Pro, and the 5.0 Ultra. Each trimmer is equipped with skin-safe technology, an LED spotlight, and unique features for different grooming needs. Oh, and they're waterproof too. For the basic trim, go with the 3.0 and work your way up to the 4.0 and 5.0 for the ultimate grooming experience. And if you're taking it on the go, Manscaped has you covered. The trimmers come with a travel case and even a travel lock feature to avoid any accidental powering on and or weird looks in the airport. So get 20% off and free shipping with the offer code DARKAGES at manscaped.com. That is 20% off and free shipping with the code DARKAGES at manscaped.com for the best your boys have ever looked. Trust Manscaped. Hello, and welcome to the Dark Ages podcast. Episode 49, Conquest and Crisis. Having dealt with the Suevi and their rapid expansion and then implosion, it's time to do a little shimmy to the left, the right, actually, and return our focus to their adversaries and ultimate destroyers, the Visigoths. The Visigoths have been with us pretty much from the beginning, especially if you accept the simplifying framework that they were descendants of the Tervingi tribe way back in the mists of pre-Hun history to the north of the Danube. Pre-Hunstery. We have seen them settle in or occupy chunks of the Balkans, invade Italy, sack Rome, be pressed hard in northern Hispania before finally finding a Roman generalissimo prepared to deal with them and carve out a federate kingdom in Aquitania, also known as southwestern Gaul. They've faced off against their eastern cousins at the cataclysmic Battle of the Catalonian Fields, and in 475 declared their independence from Rome under their aggressive and expansionist King Euric. By the time Euric died, Visigothic power extended over the Pyrenees into Hispania, and on paper, Euric's son, Alaric II, was set up to be one of the most powerful rulers in the post-Roman reality. Alas, Alaric is best known for dying in the catastrophic defeat of the Visigoth army by the Franks at the Battle of Vuil in 507, and the resulting flight of the Goths out of Gaul. This episode will be about the lead-up to and beginnings of the creation of a Visigothic polity south of the Pyrenees. We will perforce take a look at the years after the defeat at Vuil, the dark days for the Visigoths, and for Hispania, as peace and stability seem always just out of reach. But before starting out, I want to mention, as I have before, and before that, that this is a time and place that is almost entirely unrepresented in direct primary sources, by which I mean sources from Hispania at or near the time of the events described. There is only one chronicle that is contemporary, called the Consularia Caesar Augustana, and it is a marginal one. It is an annal, much like Hydadeus's, meaning it's a list of years with entries for the consuls that served in it and a note or two on any important events that may have taken place. To add to the fun, the Consularia does not survive in manuscript form in and of itself. It is not, like Priscus's account of the Huns, so many episodes ago, surviving in quotations or references in other learned works. No, the Consularia Caesar Augustana survives as notes written or copied into the margins of a copy of another book, the Chronicle of John of Biclaro. So I am not lying or being judgmental when I call it a marginal source. That is literally what it is. The work covers the years between 450 and 568, so it neatly bridges the gap between Roman and not Roman periods. However, it is pretty tightly focused on its namesake city, Caesar Augustana, known to us today as Zaragoza. Which, I guess, if you mumble and say Caesar Augustana quickly, you can see how we get to Zaragoza. That tight focus means that we have only a few mentions of the kind of thing we're interested in, and we have to use the Consularia in tandem with later writers or writers from outside Hispania, like Isidore of Seville or Jordanes or the Verrier letters of Cassiodorus, to understand the often cryptic, sometimes contradictory entries in the Consularia. I will flag those types of moments as they come up in the narrative. And, oh hey, hello, here comes the narrative again, backing up into its parking spot. We talked last time about the Visigoths' defeat of the Suevi and the execution of their king Reciar in 456, which forced the Suevi back into their stronghold in Galicia and plunged them into decades of civil war. We'll pick up basically where we left off there. The effort against the Suevi was initiated and probably led by King Theodoric II of the Visigoths. Reading between the lines, we can guess that Visigothic elites who accompanied him on his campaigns took the opportunity to grab some territory for themselves. Now, who knows what form that might have taken? Maybe local elites simply recognized the Goths' demands for taxation were lower than imperial demands had been and submitted willingly. Maybe a war band could take on garrison duty for a town or city, and the city fathers would find themselves under the thumb of the commander. Maybe vacant land or land without title could be simply occupied and the locals put back to work on it. Or maybe villas were occupied by simple brigand force, and their owners were sent flying headlong out the door with a boot-shaped print on their backside and a warning not to come back ringing in the ears. It was probably all of these, each one a little drama playing out all across the countryside. In 466, Theodoric II was murdered by his brother Euric, and whatever other changes Euric may have brought to the administration of the Kingdom of Toulouse, as it's called, there is no evidence that he did anything to stop the occupation of Hispania. On the other hand, there is little particular indication that much effort was put toward exercising central control over those provinces, and that Gothic lords probably enjoyed a fair degree of autonomy. Euric was the most expansionist of Gothic kings, fighting in the north to extend his territory to the Loire River, and in 475 he declared himself independent of the Roman Empire, meaning he did not rule as a legate, even in fiction. He was the first Germanic king to do so, and Julius Nepos, the emperor, was forced to accept and recognize that declaration in return for returned control over Provence. Most of the Roman nobility of Hispania accepted and recognized Euric as well, and after 476, even the administrators of Tarraconensis, who had held on to the empire the longest, gave up and acknowledged Euric as their overlord. Probably by around 480, Euric's on-paper dominion of the peninsula was complete. That didn't mean, though, that they were immediately crushed under a hairy Gothic boot. The idea given by maps of complete territorial control is a false one. And while most of Hispania may have acknowledged some kind of obligation to the Gothic king, the realities of communication made real control difficult. That might explain some of the seemingly contradictory entries in the Consularia Caesar Augustana. Notably, in 493, which is after 480, the chronicles note that the Goths entered Spain. And again, 4 years later, in 497, another entry, the Goths acquired settlements in Spain. So, what does that mean? It could be that the entry refers to some kind of transition where the region around Zaragoza had been paying taxes to Euric, but now Goths were arriving to take direct possession. We can't ever really be sure, of course, but that's one explanation, and it's suggestive of the very local reality of all of these grand political changes. For large chunks of the empire after 476, the only thing that really changed was the address you sent your tax return to. And actually, overall, the tax bills were lower, which certainly helped both Gallo and Hispano-Roman elites make peace with the new realities. That localism is further emphasized by a couple of other entries in the Consularia. In 496, we are told that Berdinellus became a tyrant in Spain, before being overthrown by his own men and sent to Toulouse to be horribly executed. Later on in 506, a man named Peter made himself a tyrant in Dertosa, and again was quickly deposed and executed, and his head was sent to Zaragoza for display. Peter's treason, since it didn't seem to involve crossing the mountains, may have been of a smaller magnitude than the previous one. Once again, we are stymied by a laconic chronicler, and can only guess at what might be going on here. Best guess is that both of these men attempted to declare themselves in opposition to Visigoth overlordship. Maybe they were acclaimed as emperors by their men, but such rebellions challenging Visigothic hegemony are suggestive, as I've said, that hegemony was not complete yet. Religion also played a part in the difficulties the Goths had to get a firm grip. When Clovis I of the Franks converted to Catholicism, in 500 or so, he gained access to the most advanced communications, administration, and propaganda network that existed in the absence of imperial control: the Church. The network of Catholic priests and bishops had been corresponding and deepening their connection to local society for 300 years in most places, then given an enormous boost, of course, by Constantine and his successors. As the civil administration became ever more parochial and less connected to Rome, the clerical network remained strong, a pool of connected, literate, well-educated men who still saw themselves as part of a greater pan-European unit. The Arian Church had its own network, of course, but since Arianism, especially by now, had mostly grown up among the migratory Germanic tribes, it had not been able to develop the kind of infrastructure that was available to the Catholic Church. Its position as the opposition to the established Roman Church also meant that leaders might encounter resistance based on religious grounds, where otherwise locals might be open to change in administration. As we saw even in the relative calm and harmony of Theodoric's Italy, religious differences kept the Germanic soldiers and rulers of the Roman civilians from forming an integrated, shared identity. And speaking of Theodoric, strong connections were formed between the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths after the latter's takeover of the Italian territories. Remember that the distinction between Visi and Ostro is mostly a modern construct, so we can keep our history straight. Most contemporaries referred to both peoples as simply Goths, and intermarriage between the two was common, and the connection would be useful for both, as we've already seen, and we'll see again later. Visigothic military power had helped Theodoric in his war against Odoacer, and in 494 Theodoric's daughter Ostrogotho was married to the Visigothic king Alaric II. Alaric had become king on the death of his father Euric in 484, and the alliance this marriage cemented would prove to be essential to the Visigoths in the very near future. Alaric is one of those unfortunate figures of history who is best known for his greatest failure. God forbid that this podcast should become best known for its worst episode. Which one is that, do you think? Send me an email. Alaric's great failure was his defeat and death at the Battle of Vuil, fought against the Franks in 507. We talked about it in episode 35, Clovis a Conquering. The battle led to the rapid collapse of Visigothic power in Gaul, with the capture of the capital at Toulouse and the royal treasury, and the withdrawal of the ruling Balt dynasty to Narbonne on the Mediterranean coast. Only the intervention of Theodoric's army, under the command of a general named Ibba, prevented the loss of those coastal territories. And just as we saw in 456, when the Battle of Orbijo triggered the collapse of the Suevi, a single engagement threatened the whole Visigothic kingdom. But why did it? Why are these individual clashes so often decisive? Now it is a common understanding that one can lose a battle but still win a war. So, why was it different then? Well, there are a few reasons, some of them specific to the Visigothic case, and some more general principles. To begin with the specific and immediate first. We can't be sure how many Visigoths had crossed over into Hispania to grab territory and glory, but we can be pretty sure that in these early stages, most of them were fighting men, and depending on how large the units were, and they were probably not huge, a relatively large proportion of them would have been commanders. So it may have been that when Clovis arrived, that Alaric II did not have the full military resources of the Gothic kingdom available to him to meet the threat. The slim pickings may have contributed to the defeat at Vuil, and that plays into a more general discussion of the culture that helped make individual battles so potentially catastrophic. The cultural mores that existed around kingship and military practice, and seem to have been common among most of the Germanic peoples, seem to have been practically purpose-built to ensure that one battle could be decisive. The legitimacy of the king depended on his ability to lead and enrich his most important men, so a sense of confidence and air of success was absolutely essential. In return, the leading fighting men of the kingdom pledged their absolute loyalty, and they weren't kidding about that. It was expected that if a king or great lord died in battle, his closest retainers would fight to avenge him, or failing that, would stand and fight to the last man rather than surrender. The chronicles are full of large and small conflicts that end with the band of merry warriors going cheerfully to their deaths, covered in honor and glory, for they did not abandon their lord in his time of need. All very romantic, but it meant that in the case of a large battle, a kingdom might have a sizable portion of its military elites simply scraped off and killed in one go, and that made mounting a counteroffensive difficult. Ironically, the absence of so many lords away in Hispania may have preserved a large enough segment of the Visigothic elite so that the kingdom could carry on, even with the king dead and Aquitaine lost. So the very circumstance that helped assure defeat may have also assured recovery. One quick digression. There is an interesting second component of royal legitimacy that came to my attention while doing the reading for this episode, and it has to do with treasure, the shiny stuff. You may remember, if you are currently binging the podcast, or if you have a truly impressive memory, that I made a note of the capture of the royal treasury at Toulouse by the Franks, back there in episode 35. Now, obviously it makes sense to take control of the defeated kingdom's money, but it turns out it's more than that. Besides the rather mercenary relationship between king and elites, the royal dynasty's legitimacy was based on an understanding of a shared history. That shared history is recorded and personified by the royal treasure. Aside from the material wealth it represents, it usually contained objects that recalled past events and achievements. This kind of thing has been going all the way back to Mesopotamia, where a victorious army would often take a defeated city's god, its icon, back to their own temple, thus stealing the god and announcing to the world their superiority. In a less mystical but still psychologically significant way, the royal treasure of the Visigoths or Vandals were reminders of their past victories and glories. The obvious example that I've talked about before, and here is relevant to the Vandals, is the menorah from the Temple of Jerusalem. If you remember, it was part of the treasures of Rome, and reminded the Romans of their victories over the rebellious Jews. It was captured by Gaiseric in 455, and became part of the Vandal treasure, reminding them of their victory over and the sack of Rome. Then it was taken to Constantinople by Belisarius when he defeated the Vandals. Each time it accrued a new layer of significance to a new victorious group. Though we don't have specifics, we are told that the Visigothic treasure also contained pieces from the Roman vaults that had been removed from Jerusalem during the revolt of 69 CE. And these would have taken on even more significance since the conversion of both Goth and Roman to Christianity. It would make sense for that to have been the case. Alaric I would have gathered as many tokens of his victory over the Romans as he could carry, to keep them with him as a record of his and his people's triumphs. To have the royal treasury stolen was thus to lose part of the collective memory, and so the sack of Toulouse by the Franks was a psychological blow beyond its military importance. But in spite of these blows, the Balt dynasty, which had been ruling the Visigoths since the desperate days of Alaric I, remained the royal house of the Visigoths, and a new Balt king was elected by the surviving nobles. His name was Gesalic, and he was an illegitimate son of Alaric II. We know nothing at all about his mother, other than that she is described by Isidore of Seville as a concubine, and as far as Isidore is concerned, that's all anyone needed to know to predict how this was all going to play out. Alaric had a legitimate son, Amalaric, whose mother was Ostrogotho, which made him Theodoric the Great's grandson. But primogeniture was not at all a given at this point. The most suitable candidate from the royal house would be selected to succeed the king, and Amalaric was, in 507, only 5 years old. So he was taken south into Hispania, safely away from the front lines. The nobility had gathered in Narbonne to elect Gissalic on the southeast coast of Gaul. Narbonne was an important port, and probably the largest city in Septimania. And I have to be honest with you, I just dropped the name of the region entirely so that I could launch into a digression. Septimania was the coastal strip in southern Gaul between the mouth of the Rhone and the Pyrenees. It would be part of the Visigothic domains as long as Visigothic domains existed, a little cowlick of territory on a Spanish head. Now, here's the digression part. Septimania, you may be thinking. Septimania sounds like it has something to do with the number 7. And actually, you probably weren't thinking that. You were probably thinking, oh, get on with it, loser. But it's my show, so I'm going to pretend that it was the first thing. And indeed, gentle and erudite listeners, there are 2 possible origins for the name Septimania, and they both have to do with lucky number 7. The first is that they may have come from a Roman name for the modern city of Béziers, Colonia Julia Septiminorum Beterae, which in turn is derived from the 7th Legion, many of whose veterans were settled there. I do not want to get dragged into nesting digressions, but can I just say that the Romans were absolute garbage at naming cities. They all either have 7 or 8 words each, or they're all called some version of Caesarea. It drives me up the wall trying to figure out where anything was. Anyway, the second possibility for the origin of Septimania is after the 7 civitates, cities that constituted the region. Those are now called Béziers, Elne, Agde, Narbonne, Lodève, Maguelon, and Nîmes. Now look, I know it's not really germane, but I put in all the time learning to pronounce those, so they were going in the episode come hell or high water. And if you go to the transcript and webpage for this episode on darkagespod.com, you will see that I also took the time to put in all the accents and circumflexes and stuff, so there. It feels like I'm yelling at you. I'm not. Just, it was late when I was writing this, and I was a little bit wired. Where on earth was I? Right. Gissalic. Gissalic was probably in his late 20s when he was elected king, and we have absolutely nothing contemporary to tell us anything about him. We're pretty much stuck with Isidore of Seville, who was writing over 100 years after the fact, and whose judgment is not favorable. He had neither bravery nor luck, according to the good Bishop of Seville, and most historians writing since then have pretty much followed that line. Gissalic's name, by the way, means dancing with spears, which I think qualifies as the most metal name we've encountered yet, so points for that one. The intervention of the Ostrogoths had ensured that Septimania remained Visigothic territory, but the Ostrogoths had not actually fought the Franks. They had fought the Burgundians. Alliance with the Franks had emboldened the Burgundians and their king, Gundobad. This is the same Gundobad who had been master of soldiers in Rome, but who abandoned his emperor when the position of the kingship of Burgundians became available. Anyway, after the defeat at Vuil, Gundobad pushed down the Rhone and laid siege to Arles, and the Ostrogoths, under their general Ibba, dished out heavy punishment, and pushed the Burgundians away from Arles and Avignon, and took possession of Provence for themselves. We're not exactly sure when it happened, as Isidore does not give a date, but at some point around the same time, the Burgundians also invaded further into Septimania and plundered Narbonne. Whether they decided they couldn't hold it and then withdrew to Arles, or if this was the detachment from a main invasion force, or an entirely different army in a different time, we can't really say for sure. But however it went, when the Burgundians showed up, Gissalic offered no resistance and fled Narbonne to Barcelona. Okay, so there's not much there to contradict Isidore's assessment of cowardice. But we have very little context. If the sack of Narbonne did come hard on the heels of the defeat at Vuil, then Gissalic's military resources would have been scant indeed, and a tactical retreat may have been the only option available to him. But that didn't square with the Germanic ideal of fighting to the death, and retreat, regardless of the circumstances, brought shame, and Gissalic thus may have been doomed to ignominy from the start. At first, Gissalic did enjoy the support of Theodoric the Great, since needs must, though what form that support took is hard to say. It must have been significant, though, because it apparently gave him considerable leverage over the Visigothic elites. And in 511, he deposed Gissalic in favor of the passed-over Amalaric. That couldn't have been possible without the collusion of the nobility, so dissatisfaction with their ruler must have played a part in the coup. The picture that emerges for me, sketchy though it is of a king who was dealt a very bad hand, and who got no breaks whatsoever as the events unfolded. I really wish there was more detail, because this is the kind of political maneuvering that makes for really compelling narrative if we only knew how it went down. But Isidore is resolute in his conviction that brevity is the virtue of chronicles, and as scholar E.A. Thompson noted, he could hardly have told us less except by writing nothing at all. The Visigoths acclaimed Amalaric, the legitimate son of Alaric II, as king, and since he was still a minor, at now 9 years old, Theodoric the Great declared himself regent of the Visigothic kingdom. How nice of him. After the coup, Gissalic fled to Carthage, seeking refuge with King Thrasimund of the Vandals. And we have a letter written by Cassiodorus on behalf of Theodoric that expresses the Ostrogoths' feelings on that matter. Having given you our sister, that singular ornament of the Amal race, in marriage, in order to knit the bonds of friendship between us, we are amazed that you should have given protection and support to our enemy Gissalic. If it was out of mere pity and as an outcast that you received him into your realm, you ought to have kept him there, whereas you have sent him forth furnished with large supplies of money to disturb the peace of our Gaulish provinces. This is not the conduct of a friend, much less of a relative. We are sure that you cannot have taken counsel in this matter with your wife, who would neither have liked to see her brother injured, nor the fair fame of her husband tarnished by such doubtful intrigues. We send you our ambassadors, who will speak to you further on this matter. I've covered that letter a bit before in an earlier episode. When Thrasimund handed Gissalic a bag of cash and began clearing his throat and making ostentatious glances at the door, Gissalic returned to Aquitaine, hoping to recruit men for a comeback. That's interesting in itself, since it suggests that the Frankish hold on Aquitaine wasn't particularly strong, and that there were still plenty of Visigoths settled there, some of them fighting men. It's also interesting to me because in that excerpt I just read, Theodoric refers to his Gaulish provinces. Now that may refer to Provence, which was under direct Ostrogothic control, or it may refer to Septimania, and Theodoric was letting the mask slip just a little bit. Gissalic did manage to put together some kind of army, and in 513 attempted to march on Barcelona, but he was intercepted by an Ostrogothic army commanded again by Ibba, and was defeated. And again, Gissalic fled the field. He was probably heading to try his luck with the Burgundians, but he was caught, probably near Avignon, and executed. Whether his captors were Burgundian or Ostrogoth, no one says. Gissalic was around 33 years old when he died, and he had been king of the Visigoths for 4 hard-pressed years. The decade following the overthrow of Gissalic is called the Ostrogothic Interlude by some historians. During that time, Hispania was governed by a regency government directed by Theodoric the Great, and we will talk more about how that worked, and how it all came apart, and what happened after that, in the next episode. In the meantime, thank you for listening, and thank you for your very generous contributions on ko-fi.com/darkagespod. Specific thanks to Brandon, Liam, Paul, and Melissa, all of whom were super generous, and a warm welcome to new monthly contributors, Mikhaya, apologies on the pronunciation, and Susan, who joined the stolid ranks alongside John, Barchester, Scott, Paul, Alex, Jesse, Other Paul, and Dusty. May you be placed among the firmament. If things are tight and monetary support just isn't in the cards, that's totally cool and understandable. You can also support the show by rating or reviewing it on whatever app you're using to listen. Those help visibility. And if you haven't already, just, go ahead and tap subscribe so you'll be notified whenever I manage to get myself together enough to produce a new episode. Well, that's all for today, except to mention one more time that you can get 20% off and free shipping on manscaped.com if you use the promo code DARKAGES at checkout. Until next time, take care.